I'd like to start with a little acknowledgement that the Center for Experimental Practices is based in Huddersfield in Northern England, and that modern England owes its existence to ongoing extractive and neo-colonial relations around the world, and the rights of the peoples colonized by this country to live and work freely here and to participate in the determination of its future remain unceded. Center for Experimental Practices is a small and ever more precarious new research center that is currently based at the University of Huddersfield. I will put the link to our webpage in the chat there, so if anyone can look it up if you're interested in seeing some of the activities we've done in the past. One thing I would like to point to is that we just had a wonderful seminar series run by former PhD student here named Sophie Fetukaki, which was on the topic of whiteness and sound studies. Some really interesting conversations, and most of those were recorded and the videos have been posted online, so you can go back and watch those, and you can also watch Lines of Flight videos from last year and from a couple of years ago. Thanks very much to Kate Holden and Colin Frank, who are helping to host and run these sessions. We are doing this on Microsoft Teams, so if you're interested if you have questions, if you have comments, we'll of course have time for discussion at the end, and you may join then. But if you do have thoughts as the session is going on, you're welcome to put them in the chat, and I or someone else will read them out loud. So you can participate in different ways through the chat or through commenting and asking a question later on. Well, all of that said, I'm really excited to have Michael Kliën here for the second Lines of Flight session in this current series. Michael Kliën is someone who I've known for a few years, I guess, but whose work I would like to learn much more about, and I'm really excited to learn about today. He's an artist and a choreographer whose work has been situated worldwide. His artistic practice encompasses interdisciplinary thinking, critical writing, curatorial projects, and choreographic works. He is the inaugural director of the MFA in Dance, Embodied Interdisciplinary Practice at Duke University, and also director of the Laboratory for Social Choreography. And of course, with our theme of new laboratories, I thought that this would be a really, really important example for us to learn more about. I just will maybe read the blurb from the Laboratory for Social Choreography page, which says, founded in 2020, the Laboratory for Social Choreography focuses on transforming social structures through aesthetics. It explores the fundamental role of embodiment in ethics, relations, and governance. As an interdisciplinary hub, the lab researches and develops experimental ways to learn, move, and organize in response to the pressing issues of our time, from climate change to immigration to systemic racism to unfettered capitalism. It choreographs situations that connect artists, citizens, and intellectuals in an extraordinary climate of sensibility, empathy, and vigorous imagination. So you can see how it resonates so much with the things that we want to be looking at Center for Experimental Practices. Thank you so much for joining us, Michael, and I hand it over to you now.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for joining a Microsoft team meeting in that case, rather than a Zoom. Our term here at Duke University is already over. I'm sort of haven't been busy for a month. Have been very much a father of two wonderful kids. So I'm kind of restarting my deep thought engine here because this summer I sort of took off, planning to take off after a very hard year. So stick with me while we're gathering speed. I hope that we can also turn this into a dialogue or into some sort of life-giving conversation. I haven't prepared any visuals as such. I invite anybody who's interested in just Googling Laboratory for Social Choreography at Kliën Institute, Duke University, or Google my Vimeo site or Google my website, and you'll find plenty of links to things. You might want to do that parallel. I also haven't prepared a real linear structure for this talk. So in line with the thought of, or with the theme of laboratories, I will try to both to kind of work around and describe maybe what the laboratory does, how it functions, how it's set up, like giving a little bit of a very practical insight of how this came about. and at the same time also trying to kind of convey what social choreography tries to do, what we are trying to do here at Duke, and beyond the boundaries of Duke, of course. And yeah, give a sense of it. At any point, put the questions on the side. Maybe I just take them in flight and answer them. And I hope, yeah, that the most of it will actually be conversational. If you've got a pressing question, please just stop me and ask. I have no problem with that at all. Good. So where do I start? Well, personally, I'm just sort of might be of interest. I'm trained in dance. I trained a lot in painting as well, but mainly dance. I had a dance company early on. I used to live in London for 8 years. I used to live in Ireland for 10 years, and I used to work for Ballet Frankfurt. I used to work for opera houses. But mainly I was interested, like once I hit sort of like 21, to create institutions that had sort of an utopian impulse behind them, to create institutions that stand out, that are different to the status quo. And that was very early on, but I was in London, and we created sort of artists' living rooms in the wake of this excitement of the internet in the 90s. That was the big democratizing tool. And we all saw the new world order, being much more fair through it. Later on, I went to Ireland and had a company called Dagda on the west coast of Ireland, and there we really took it more seriously in terms of this kind of theoretical basis of what it could potentially mean to run an organization that has a utopian impulse. And it was an extremely well publicly funded institution for a while before it all collapsed in 2011 and 12, when I went to Greece, to Athens, to actually work as a freelance choreographer and be part, sort of experience what Greece went through during very difficult years for the country, and set up again on one of the Mediterranean islands an organization called RISE, which was it could stand for anything, the Real Institute for Cybernetic Epistemology or Choreographic Inquiry, or whatever you wanted it to stand for. It had a multitude of meanings. And it was somewhat a summer school, a school without teachers on the island of Hydra, where a lot of people, up to 60 artists, non-artists, citizens, philosophers, thinkers, intellectuals, gathered for the summer to suspend kind of the social norms. And that went on for a few years. And then I came to Duke University in North Carolina, which is, for anybody who doesn't have an image of North Carolina, it's where most of Dirty Dancing was filmed. So a lot of trees, very beautiful place. And yeah, and so at Duke, my task was to build up with a colleague, Purnima Shah, to build up a master's program, an MFA, so Master's in Fine Arts, which turned out to be in embodied interdisciplinary praxis, which we launched a few years ago. And I stopped being the director after a couple of years, so I'm no longer the director. And Sarah Wilbur is Professor Wilbur. And I've really focused on the creation and on the running of my laboratory here, which is the Laboratory for Social Choreography. So now, as into the history of the lab itself, it started out as a work. When I arrived here, full disclosure, this was my first academic job. I arrived as somebody who really worked a lot in academia in terms of guest teaching, but mainly worked as an artistic director and as a choreographer. And so when I arrived here, it was obviously clear that that there was a paradigm shift that happened in my own life in terms of the structures that I certainly probably wasn't prepared for, the clarity of the system to some degree. And I think within Duke University, it's a highly privileged university, as it's a private research university. So the financial aspect is actually surprisingly good in terms of being resourced well, space-wise, project-wise, and so on. But I thought, okay, there's only a handful of artists in Duke University that are active artists that are working and are professors. So it's early on clear that I needed some other outlet, some sort of way to connect artistic practice with the kind of larger academic concerns or just concerns of thought in a way. And yeah, I started a working group in Michael Hart's. Michael Hart is a well-known professor in literature here. He was the chair of literature, student of Frederick Jameson. And so I started in his lab, it was the social movements lab, and looked at different social movements across the world. I started a working group for social choreography, which basically I convinced like 10 people to come into a studio and try out different constellations, relational exercises, relational kind of propositions. And it was like pulling teeth initially to gather people to bring in this, a lot of convincing work, but it gathered speed, and only a couple of years later, I was offered to turn it into a full laboratory by the Kliën Institute of Ethics. And a full laboratory doesn't mean necessarily spaces. It means that you have an annual budget, but there is a number of laboratories in the humanities and at Kliën. So usually there are around 8 a year, between them like 4 or 4, and they come with 3-year funding, but they're also renewable. Some of them are renewable, especially at Kliën. So we've started, we now have our own space. It's not a great, it's not an amazing space. It's just like a classroom space that we have furnished, but we have our own space. And we do our events mainly in all different kinds of spaces across the university. So that's the kind of setup that we have at the moment, that we have for the foreseeable future. There's no, what I find particularly exciting about that being part of the Kliën Institute of Ethics is that as an sort of artist, a working artist, this is a lab that is really outside of the arts. So the people who fund it are not within their specialism is not arts in any way. The conversations are really around ethics. The conversations are around all kinds of societal concerns, and very little about art. So I have no chance of being trapped in an echo chamber of artistic inquiry. Let's put it that way. And I talk to Trump-appointed judges as much as I talk to enlightened investment bankers, as I talk to great scholars. So there's an unusually broad audience and resonance room, I find, that I wasn't used to. Like you used to preach to the converted in a way, both with students and faculty and academic and broader community. Now, if we talk about social choreography, because many people will ask, what is that social choreography? And I will take a sip before I dive into that big field. It has become sort of a name that, or a term for many different things. And I'm aware that many different people use it in many different ways, and that's totally acceptable. I have absolutely, I'm not trying to kind of own, or we are not trying within the lab, trying to own that term. We have worked under the term social choreography since the year 2003 or so. Officially, since the year 2000, we've been really concerned with the themes around social choreography. And then, of course, there was this big book by Andrew Hewitt. I don't know if many people know it, but also from the field of literature, again, with a foreword by chance, pure chance, by Frederick Jameson, called Social Choreography. And that book, it came out in 2008 and was sort of a game changer for many people, I think, working with social choreography. I initially didn't realize that there is an overlap. It was the language was just too intense in the book for me to really see the parallels to my work. But once I really truly unfolded it and took time to read it a couple of years later, I realized, no, there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of a kind of theory that is helpful to contextualize that any kind of a rehearsal or any choreography is basically a rehearsal of a utopian, nevertheless real social situation or social structure. I think that's sort of the core quote out of this book that I take away from it. And that whenever you do choreography, we're actually rehearsing utopian social structures, whether they're going in the way of the dominant ideologies, or they're going into subversive ideologies, or minor, sort of smaller, kind of fragile ideologies that are not, voices that are not yet heard. They're always some sort of rehearsal of a real, because they are lived, you experience it as a dancer or as a performer, you actually live these new or other kind of social organizations. And I thought that's a very strong and very interesting core point to start from in social choreography, that what started out that most choreographers would do, like even Derrida says, politics is setting people into artificial relations at some point. And I feel like throughout my training as a choreographer, that's what we do. We set people into artificial relations. But mostly back in my days, at least of training, that was in front of mirrors. And it wasn't conscious that we're doing this, and that the potential of that practice, of that you're actually practicing politics, and that you can develop new political forms, a new political relationality, that wasn't clear to me till much later. Of course, it's saying that social choreography has now also developed sort of like a theoretical base. In terms of the lab, that's not what we do really. Like, we don't publish essays, or we don't publish papers around social choreography. At least we don't do it at the moment. That might be something that might come out of it. I tried, and if you go to the website for the Laboratory for Social Choreography, you find a little kind of blurb, and I think it sort of captures what I think social choreography is, and it says, or how I relate to it, not what I think it is, but how I relate to it, is that social choreography permeates the tightly knit fabric of socialization for other potential realities to be sensed and experienced, and for new relational fields amongst human and non-human to be forged. So it's a recognition that we live in a highly codified, pre-established relational world that is not necessarily the real, but it is predominantly entrenched and sedimented for whatever reason, for historical reasons, for many different reasons. But that in these, by actually opening up and starting to see that fabric of socialization, you can also, through proposition, through kind of time and space, you can also create experiences of potentially other realities. And that includes realities between the human and the human, and the human and the non-human, of course. And so part of social choreography deals with this uncovering of these underlying social relations and patterns, as in what actually is the pattern formation of the social. And we do that through embodied practices, but maybe the slight difference is that it's not just we do it and then we have some sort of a hypothesis, or we have a statement and then we write about it, or we talk about that discovery, but actually by infusing other kinds of ways of seeing or dynamics, we're always engaging directly, trying to create a new embodied field, a new embodied situation. So it becomes sort of a rehearsal again, of another kind of reality between people. It sounds, I don't know if it sounds complex, but it's actually pretty straightforward. One example of the work that I've been doing now for 10 years is called Parliament. And it's for those who want to experience it, it's going to be a 2 full months exhibition of Parliament at the Benaki Museum in Athens, which is one of the main museums, in June, July next year. And basically what Parliament does, it brings citizens together that in a space, 50, let's say 50 people, could be 150 people, could be 25 people. And you then, without your mobile phones, without anything to really play or play with, you enter an empty room and spend 6 hours with others that are strangers to you, without language. And there's nothing to sit on except the floor. There's nothing to look at except each other. And there is a short, brief introduction to Parliament that gives you some basic tools to navigate these 6 hours. And throughout this 6 hours, what initially starts as a really a kind of hell, because hell is others. And every time I do it, anytime I'm in Parliament, I'm thinking like, why did I do this again? It's just such a horrible feeling. It's just, you feel like nothing's happening. It's just the void that is right in front of you. But actually what is happening after a while, and usually that takes 40, 50 minutes, you lose your sense of time, you lose these senses of being dedicated or subconsciously dedicated to a kind of to an upkeeping of a social reality that you usually would do in other social realms. And by doing that, things appear and you start relating to people differently. And so within the experience of Parliament, there is not one typical way how it goes. Different places react differently to it, but often, very often, it starts out as complete alienation, and it ends up as one big pack of mammals that groom each other, that play with each other, that sleep. And this mammalian wisdom, in a way, or sort of a mammalian reality that's coming to the fore, holds for so many people a much saner reality than the reality outside of Parliament, which is surprising, as often you get, if you come in as a visitor, you could conclude that people look insane, like in a very traditional viewing, that there's some sort of insanity going on or taking over the situation, when in fact people feel saner than they've ever felt before. I mean, that's direct feedback from many participants. So we've done parliaments now for many, many years in many different variations. There are thousands of people who went through parliaments. And now for the first time next year, we're actually going to do a full-on 2 months long parliament in one of the museums in Athens. Again, not really aimed, even though the container is still a museum in this context, I think it's aimed to repurpose the museum into some sort of social engine or catalyst for thought between enabling citizens to find new kind of realities between them and new connections between them. So now what we're trying to do, and I think what has sort of sedimented out of the last few projects that we did, and maybe I will go into what the lab actually does on different projects. I think we're dealing with sort of 4 pillars that I want to quickly just mention. One is that we really try to expand the known, as in that people get comfortable with not knowing, with the unknown. There's a great, let me see, no, I can't think of that source now, but that there's some sort of getting acquainted with touching the void on a permanent basis, within conversations, within relations, within institutions, and within the social, as a first pillar, like expanding the known and rather destabilizing that there's just the known out there, and actually expanding the field into making it more porous towards the unknown. Another field is awareness, expanding awareness to actually show people that they feel more than they feel more and sense more than most people allow themselves to feel or sense or see, and that these feeling, sensing, and seeing, that these personal realities actually have a part to play in social organizations and can be tapped into as a resource to expand a broader social organizing. The imagination as a third pillar, like an expanded imagination, because I feel, it points towards, my work points towards that things that we have not experienced, or we have not physically been aware of to some extent. It's very hard to make it into the imagination. We think of the imagination often in a social construct as this kind of boundless energy of potential, when I find it to be extremely bounded, usually, the imagination. For example, if I get a group together of students, 70 students here at Duke, first-year students, who have been extremely used to fulfill various different agendas to become part of an elite university. So that is not inspiring creative thought, that is not inspiring really the wild imagination at all. And when we come together and the premise is, how could a new school at Duke look like? Like, what would it entail? How rich could it be? For the first half an hour, you mostly get things like, I don't want them to charge extra for oat milk. You know, like this, I'm giving real examples here. Yeah? So where you would lose your faith in the next generation, but then it takes really a long time to stimulate the imagination of the individual before the whole group is able to feel like there is, they can think in that way, that things could open up in radical ways, and that things are possible to think, even just to think, even just to have visions of another way of living, and having them together, because that also is a very fragile and how would you say, a certain kind of it requires a mutual vulnerability. And how do you create these places of mutual vulnerability? That is also a core question in this, because if everybody stays within a sort of defended self, imagination cannot take hold of the situation. So, you know, social choreography engages that, especially in the way I see the lab. And then, of course, also into the possibilities, expanded imagination, expanded awareness, and the expanded known creates expanded possibilities. Robert Musil, who's a great Austrian writer who I refer to a lot, he talks about the third possibility, like that we constantly in daily life are kind of presented with binary choices, that there's always the unthought thought between those two choices, or outside of those two choices. And I like that very much, that this notion of that there is an unthought thought, and that we that is this binary in terms of possibilities. There's always more possibilities than we think there are, and to actually proactively seek them out. And within, and I'm just so within the lab, and maybe I haven't fully covered that yet, I'm interested in how these relational realities are carried within the body. I think they're called micropolitics at the time and macropolitics. They're different words from different writers and different scholars. I'm particularly interested because my background is systems theory and systems theoretical training through my PhD. I studied in Edinburgh University at ECA. I'm particularly interested in how we can look at the body's organization and how these organizations and the ideologies we carry within our with our daily moving, with our moving in dance, how that is actually also replicated throughout all scales of organization. How we have modalities of organization that are, in our case, the Western world, modalities of the Western world, that are predominantly linear, that are predominantly boxy, boxes within boxes within boxes, and that it's almost impossible to escape these categories of organization, even when we move together. And when you give people the option to move freely together, usually that replicates social order very quickly. And it takes an intervention or sort of an incision, a precise sort of incision into making people into people's ideas of how to move and how different people could move. And that takes a long time. Usually it takes a whole term to free is the wrong word, but I think the word is decolonize or their self. Of course, there's always a saying like if you decolonize, then something else is taking hold. What is that other that is taking hold? So it's different ideologies that are competing in a way. And I'm a big believer both in, or I'm a proponent of recursive epistemology, which is the worldview of that sort of Gregory Bateson named in the 60s and 70s in his book Steps to an Ecology of Mind, as well as Mind and Nature. And that was a massive influence because, you know, one of Ben's question was like, what are your major lines of thought? And mine was certainly coming from both an ecological perspective, informed through Gregory Bateson's worldview, which is called the Batesonian worldview, which looks at recursion at a really deep level, as in what originally was called feedback, but actually says of how do we make each other possible and constantly free or bind each other into situations. And with us, I mean anything living and or even non-living, wherever we put that boundary. And so for me, that, you know, Batesonian thought, systemic thought, as well as thoughts of deconstruction and recently of decolonization, all informing the kind of practice of the lab here, that what we actually do. Now, in these entrenched orderings, it reminded me of a quote, and I haven't got the source. I don't know who said it, but you might know who said it. That the next, it's almost like a rally cry. I don't even know if it sounds like an internet meme at this point. It's like that the next evolutionary step will be cultural and not technological. And I mean, it's a rallying cry. It's obviously not true. For example, I teach a course in or have taught a course in Creativity 101 type, it's called, or how to become an ordinary genius. And the idea was define a problem, find a solution. And you find that all undergraduates, unprompted, will go for an app. For any problem there is, they will have an app for it. And they will develop the app, you know, that will solve some aspect of the problem, but of course it will create new problems through the app. Famously, you can see it in mindfulness and the stress the mindfulness apps themselves can cause. But in this next evolutionary step, the second part I ask the students, okay, how, if after 6 weeks you have now all these apps, how can you do the same problem, you know, look at the same problem and only find cultural solutions through it? And you'll find you have to think harder, but anything can be can be solved without this quote unquote technology, because obviously it's also a technology. It's a cultural technology, is also technology. So I'm particularly interested in, rather than this sort of fetishizing of technological progress, and I've been very engaged till 2001 in creating computer systems for choreography, for example, in the UK, which I completely abandoned in 2001 when I realized it's actually more interested in working with the dancer as a collaborator and creating a kind of, instead of an artificial intelligence, creating a collective intelligence, instead of an augmented reality, create an analog augmented reality in terms of foregrounding certain things in reality that for a short space and time makes you see the world differently again, or makes you experience the world differently, because you foreground certain aspects, certain things that are usually a minor gesture, but by foregrounding them, your whole reality becomes augmented. And the same with virtual reality. We've just done this big event at Duke called, well, originally it was called 11th Organ, now it's called Inauguration, where people came together to, in a theater space, an empty theater space, so no seats, just basically a big box. And there was a 15 minutes introduction to really explain how this works. But the idea was to purely imagine possibilities between the people that you're with and with yourself. And create, and then obviously as things move, you have to adjust your imagination. If people start moving around, your imagination is starting to change. But what out of this process happened, this was an incredible virtual experience of virtual reality that really asked, because you had an experience for 1 hour, over an hour, where you were in a story that were completely imagining, but at the same time the others imagined you into their story, and so the stories seemed to fuse because you got cues by people moving away to and from you of what's going on. And so it felt like a lucid dream. It felt like virtual reality again, but a kind of analog virtual reality that was at the same time an augury, a type of from the Romans and the Greek Romans, a kind of truth telling, or a kind of reading of signs to actually affect your now, your presence. And this kind of other ways of thinking about the imagination, it also this way, and part of these events, or of these kind of choreographies, social choreographic situations that we create, is always that there are a lot of different professors part of it, a lot of different students that are part of it. So it's a wide-ranging participatory group that's in there. And it creates all these questions, as in, what is imagination? We have courses on neurology of the imagination and so on here at Duke, but nobody can tell you, once they're in this situation, in this particular inauguration, everything becomes mystery and unknown and interesting, and a sense of wonder, a sense of awe is re-entering the situation, whether you're a neurologist or a social scientist. And that's kind of this a kind of churning the soil of experience, or this churning the soil of knowledge by infusing experience, and creating a kind of new nutrition for dialogue between the different disciplines, between the kind of, what I say, stale forms of ordering. Because in terms of order, and I teach a class on ordering throughout the kind of S choreography, you can easily see how a kind of an aristocratic, what's the word? An aristocratic leftover fetish is still imbuing choreographic praxis and dance in the Western world to a large degree. And that these waves are very long waves. The way of the body, how the body inhabits political realities. It's not like because revolution has been here, the unconscious knows that. I think it sort of continues for a long time unless it's really examined. At least unless there are real new strategies that are offered, that can be offered, that are developed of how to move now, of how to move differently together. So part of the lab is exactly to create these, on one hand, situations, which I call social choreographic sites, and they go, we've done a big one for the Athens Festival last summer with a group of, an inclusive theater group, a performance group called Endynami, who are really great, almost superstars in Greece right now. So we did a big work there, but we also create these formats and methodologies. Like we are proactively developing methodologies at the lab. The last one was called the 11th Organ Symposium, that maybe stands out, where we had 23 Duke professors from Roland Blesser, from string theory to Felvin Sarr to from Roman studies. So there's from all kinds of intellectuals that came together to talk to each other through a different kind of framework. So they could present their ideas, but then you would freely associate to it with childhood memories, with real dreams, nighttime dreams, with political day-to-day issues. But the whole thing would just move for 6 hours between 20 people as one matrix of thought. And we just basically did this when was that? Last December. We just got the transcript, so we're working on this. And we continue a working group with 8 professors next fall, where we're also going to edit it into a book. And the whole symposium was towards the survival of species, Sort of trying to create new thought out of, and it sort of spectacularly works and it spectacularly fails still. So it does both. But I think it worked enough for people to have a real appetite for it. Like there were these glimpses of half an hour here or an hour there where you go like, oh my God, this is kind of, within a very short time, you have a compressed ideas just like flowing out and new ways of thinking about problems flowing out. And in a community which you think that has nothing in common as well. I think this community that is really brings together from all walks of life. Here in particular now at the university, but we kind of try to bring that into, when we work on parliaments, we try to bring people that would never be together in the same room. Just that we strive to create demographics that would never share the same room. So even just being in the same room is an unusual experience, maybe. We create various different interventions. Some of them are pedagogical, like I run these kind of think tanks with some students. We are thinking up pedagogical formats for classes, and then we also discuss a lot frameworks like the next cultural institution. There I mentioned Steve Falk, who I work with for years now, who's a dramaturg, used to work with Robert Wilson and then William Forsythe for many years. And the next cultural institution is really aimed at how could an institution look like, or what would it be that is not an opera house, that is not a gallery, not a museum, or not one of the institutions that comes with a lot of historical agendas and therefore cannot really respond to contemporary situations. How can you create a new kind of institution that is equally well funded, that brings citizens and instills a certain hyper creative sensibility in citizens, together with artists, intellectuals, citizens at large, to actually tackle contemporary problems that society faces. And it's, on one hand, it's sort of I'm really confused why that is so difficult for people to grasp in terms of why that is not already there. I feel like it literally does not exist, such organizations, and maybe the university should be or could be such a thing. And the kind of, and at the moment, the American university system is sort of providing a refuge to artists, but it's not. It just happened. I think it's not kind of a planned. It's not there's no master plan to do that. It's just that by everything drying up, by the rents going up in the US context, universities are the last kind of a place where you can make a living while being an artist, or one of the very few last places where you can do that. So that's the kind of rough overview. Again, there are different social choreographies around, and I'm also going to mention just briefly that, for example, Steve Falk, who I just mentioned, who I work with a lot, if we talk about the Möbius band of organizational, what's the right word, of organizational sensibility or modalities, if on one hand of the Möbius I work like in the petri dish of human experience in a lab. That's how I feel sometimes. I create these little bounded situations in which people can experience other realities, and we bring them together to do that, and to actually learn about how our psychic structure constructs itself, or the psychic world that we inhabit constructs itself, and to actually change it around. And then on the other hand of the Möbius band is really the institution building. Like how does this translate? And Steve, for example, he's on his bicycle connecting institutions with each other in the craziest ways, and he's developed, like he started out, sparked off, for example, homeless shelters that just won the German Architecture Award last year, by connecting social services with artists, with people in politics, and by just continuously doing that. So his social choreography is like being in the field of the city or of the social, and really working within the social services, working within the city to connect the city with itself. And again, if we think about traditionally, choreography there's been sort of a lot of discourse around expanded choreography that takes choreography off the stage and then just works with it in the social, whereas I'm kind of a proponent of both of expanded and recursive. Like expanded would just mean to use the same principles that you use on stage, which are usually linear and hierarchical in a traditional sense, and then just apply them, sort of all your biases, apply all your biases within society. And what I think within the lab we're proposing is to actually really thoroughly examine all that reality before we bring it out into the social realm. Whew, and I think I'll leave it there in terms of just my short little introduction. And I see a question: how does one become a participant in Parliament? You just show up. That's how you can usually become a participant in Parliament.
Thank you so much. I think we said we'd take a little break, so let's take just like 3-4 minutes. People can do anything that they need to do. If you have burning questions or comments, you can put them in the chat, or please join us again in 3-4 minutes and we will continue. I have lots of things that I wanted to ask.
Super. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back. Well, I have big questions and they're all sort of connected, but maybe we should start with what's in the chat already. I think there's plenty of time. So someone has written, thanks for this. Would you be willing to say more? This is very concrete. Would you be willing to say more about how social choreography may have political traction? How does it produce political action?
Damn. I mean, that's an ongoing that's an ongoing discussion, of course, in terms of instantly. I want to answer with a Gregory Bateson quote saying the situation is so serious we have no time to rush. But that is more obviously within the ecological disaster that we really need to develop like deep sensed other realities that we can inhabit, and in terms of production and relationality. And I think this one works on the magma of politics. I don't know if that's the right term, or in a sense, it's not there to kind of instantly create solutions to political problems that are faced. It deals with the kind of inherent with the politics in the making, with the very kind of foundations of ethics and relationality. I feel like that's where the lab is really is working from. But I find what I find, my experience tells me that it very quickly scales. I think usually why it doesn't scale is because you don't have the kind of power to scale it. It lacks power, in a sense, political power, that you're just not in office, or you don't have the resources to scale it. What I found in Ireland, for example, when I had much less language around these themes, that now I've got much more language, of course, but we started out in 2005. We had this, and it's just, and I don't know if it translates directly into politics, but what happened is, by creating this way, by actually starting with being in a dance studio and thinking, how should we move now, and how should we move together now, and what is ethical, and how do we actually start moving together, that these kind of insights that were wrought out of the body, wrought out of kind of, and even unconscious as well, very quickly scaled, because I was the CEO as well of that company, and we had a lot of money. It was very large, quickly scaled into a different kind of reality, and into a sort of a organization that really you could step into, and you realize that it has a different way of relating to power, relating to different social function within. Like, it wasn't a dance company. Like, we stopped touring. We even stopped dancing when we opened the thing, and instead of dancing, we talked to 1,000 people about what dance means to them, what choreography means to them for the first 5 weeks, before we resumed dancing with that knowledge in the back. We invited all these kind of intellectuals from across the world, from anthropology and the theology, to talk about how they see dance, rather than and maybe how they relate to dance, so we can expand our social understanding of how dance could function in society. And then at the same time, at the end, this organization basically had worked on basic income for 15 artists. It had like all these different schemes that were really before its time, that we tried out. So it had a real, and it was in the city, a kind of very important. Limerick City is a poor city. So within the city, it had a very high standing. It was actually the federal government that took it down, which is also very unusual, while the city tripled its funding in the last year of our existence, because we also kind of completely reformed the way people were working with people with adults with special needs, with Down syndrome. And that's by pure chance, like simply because of curiosity into the unknown from our side, and by taking that as part of our ethos of how we worked. We became, for a short while in Ireland, the forerunners of working with people with Down syndrome, for example, which was nobody's plan in the company, and it just happened, and it had huge ramifications. Like we opened the Special Olympics with the Cranberries live on stage, for example, and nobody could foresee that. Like, really crazy things happened. There were documentaries made on national television. We just had a complete different relationality. We had no training. We had naivety, and we just wanted to move together. So it scales very quickly into real political actions. And projects like the biggest projects on Down syndrome, like the Down Drag or the Beauty Project or so on, these were done by the same artist who ran that in Dacta, for example. So worldwide, some of the biggest projects. So I think things scale so quickly, and they are obviously they are political in nature, because they change our perception of what is a political actor, or what is an agent, what is who's taking part in the discourse. And when I talk about politics, and I'm just gonna finish, but in this last work, they called the Utopians. Well, today utopia is a big word here in this talk, which usually it isn't. But within the Utopians, it was like that democracy is built up of parts of bodies that are very much relate to a certain rationality or a certain kind of agency within a much larger existence of a body. And so we were thinking about and contemplating, how would a democracy of souls look like, that take where the decision making is really amongst souls rather than amongst just bodies. And here the soul was the soul was the body, like the knowledge of the body, rather than parts of the body that are a certain kind of rational decision making power. So that was also interesting to say, like, how could we even think about a democracy of souls? How would that look like? How could we govern a space like that? How can we govern a large-scale situation with such premise? So that was a long-winded answer around that.
Yeah, no, lots of very interesting things there. I'll hold off. Sophie, if you want to come in with your question or comment.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for that. That was really, really interesting. I was just following actually on from that question, wondering about how you, not you personally, but both you personally in the practice and who you find yourselves with in these experiments and encounters, like how difference is processed or responded to. Like, because I can imagine, for example, some people have a very different or more nuanced understanding of these kind of pre-rehearsed social roles or relations than others. Some people might have a lot of assumptions about that, or maybe not. You know, there might be quite a difference there, and and it might be hard to talk about without specific examples, but like how that emerges. Yeah, basically that. Yeah.
I mean, I think if I understand your question right, part of these, I think it's built into the premise of any of the sites or works, is that everybody comes with completely different expectations, realities, openness, closedness, willingness, and all that is part of it. Like everything, like in Parliament, for example, it's not to create a linear outcome or a predicted outcome, or any of these sites actually is to make this predicted outcome. It's to see what happens if you do what you're doing. And then you actually learn also about, and a lot of parliaments don't go, they might be utopians for some, in the sense of really utopian for some, but they might also be dystopian for others. And so it's interesting of why, what does this reality do, and how, and other strategies to be found to make it more equitable. So that is all part of the process. It's not sort of, but we need to have kind of sites in which they can be tested out, which they're fairly safe places to test it out. Like if I feel like if as creative artists, well-meaning artists in the world, we can't sort it out, or we can't create the conditions in which things can be sorted out between people, then there's very little chance that it can happen outside of these spaces, because when the creativity and the willingness is really there to experiment
Mm.
and play, if you want, we sort of playing for real is a big part of the laboratory. Like, and how do you engender these situations that people start playing for real? So I don't know if that answered your question at all.
Yeah, I guess I was kind of wondering if you have you observed any kind of patterns, or have there been moments where there was an impasse, for example, where
Well, there is, I mean, there's certain patterns. Oh no, I'm not that often in the room as well in some of the work. Simply because if I'm in the room, then there's certain sort of authority in the room that then people perform towards. So it's like by taking myself, unless I'm very comfortable with the people and they're comfortable with me, I'm actually not in the room. And then I just listen to stories that emerge out of the room. But yeah, I mean, there's often impasses where things are described where certain people take over parliament and almost do not let the other people in, or they're so reveling in their own revelations, and they're so convinced of their own revelations that it closes off possibilities for others. So I mean, and that can happen regularly, and it might also demonstrate certain social dynamics between race-based factors or social factors. So you can observe those pretty clearly in Parliament. Often, sometimes they disappear as well. So it's this, and because as Parliament, I mean, I also did a work called Amendment because I wanted to amend some of the pitfalls of the first work, and then we created this work Constitution the year after to kind of. And now we just finished inauguration. So we have these 4 works that almost try to hold the pitfalls of the others. So together they work in a strange way. Like there is no perfect societal setup, but there is at least a space in which we can rehearse and try out and experiment with these other setups, with these other sensibilities and realities and relationalities in a semi-safe situation, right? I mean, touch is a big thing, and that's always being discussed in Parliament because people touch each other quite intensively in Parliament, which is surprising. And over the last, over the whatever 1,000, 2,000, how many people went through Parliament? For sure, over 2,000, I think. You would have so far there were no complaints about touch ever, even though people get very touchy. But it's a negotiation of touch. So there's a very clear briefing of how to negotiate touch. Rather than saying don't touch or you have to ask for verbal permission, you say no, there's no verbal permission, there's no talking. Can you still negotiate touch? Can you still, realize what does it take if the other person is ready or not ready to be touched? And that's I think it's a superpower that humans have, but it's also a kind of forgotten or kind of blunted superpower that we have. And yeah, so that, I don't know if that answers it. Trying.
No, that's great. It's really fun. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to definitely follow up on that. I had these different questions, but I think what I want to ask really very much responds to that. But I do have a certain kind of narrower question that I want to ask you that I've been just wanting to ask you for like months, if not years, ever since I saw these, I started to see the photos and the descriptions of Parliament. I've never been to any of these events, so I'm just kind of watching from a distance, But as I'm watching the descriptions of Parliament, some of the little videos, and I'm thinking this is also something that's come up in some of the recent seminars, including the ones that Sophie hosted, where I keep coming back to this question of the lineage of the sort of, I guess you could say, the white avant-garde of the 1960s and the 70s. What are we doing with it? One of the, we kept coming back to John Cage in whiteness and sound studies conversations, but I'm of course always coming back to Grotowski. And I'm watching these descriptions. I'm like, this is paratheater. This is the beehive. This is the vigil. You know, these things that were done in the 70s, which then, you know, very interestingly, like there was this huge kind of moment. It goes along with the human potential movement, with, you know, different kinds of also political hippie movements and everything. And then there's this kind of, I guess, a backlash or a turn away from it in the 80s and the 90s, where it just feels, everybody kind of thinks, well, that was very naive. It was very utopian, exactly. It was kind of like, oh, we thought we could get in a room and move around and that would change the world, but it totally didn't. There's the re-entrenchment of neoliberalism. And I'm just, so I've been fascinated to be like, wait. The main structure here is that you get all these people in a room for 6 hours and they don't talk. Like this was a huge thing in the 70s that was, it seemed to be kind of, and it was always, I think, so that was, I was thinking today about like what are the key differences that I see, and I'm sure, you know, you have a different perspective, but like for what I'm seeing in this conversation also is like part of what was happening there that I see is different, and it has exactly what Sophie asked about difference, is that those groups, human potential movement, post-Grotowskian paratheater, or Grotowskian paratheater, they were founded first of all on a certain sense of similarity, on a desire for similarity. And you know, Grotowski's ensemble at that time was always talking about like, we're looking for the people who are like us. They might be from a different economic class or country or whatever, but they share this because there was this countercultural sense of like, we are not the mainstream, we're pushing back. And so what's so striking to me from a distance is like, this kind of general structure somehow is now at the Keenan Center for Ethics at Duke University. It's like, and but what I'm hearing also, you know, and then as you say, like these, you know, professors of string theory and economics are like coming into the room and doing a kind of post-Grotowskian beehive in 2024. And they're not saying, what is this hippie nonsense? They're sort of present to it. But I also think that there is a different relationship to sameness versus difference. Like you're starting from the perspective of everyone who comes is completely different, different in ways that we can see, different in ways that we can't see. And so, you know, I think the biggest difference I see is that those Grotowskian paratheater events, as much as they did incorporate my understanding of it, you know, a flow of moments, there could be a more relaxed moment and a more intensive moment, etc. They were looking for a heightened sense of communitas, a heightened moment of like exuberance and, you know, this kind of jouissance, whatever it is. Whereas I think what I'm hearing from you is much more like non-judgmental, non-teleological. We don't know what's going to happen. You know, basically, because we now acknowledge difference and we're not looking for a kind of unification in some kind of spiritual transcendence, just being in the room is kind of as much as we can bear. It's as much as we can handle. And like, if we can manage being in the room together for 6 hours without an ethical complaint being lodged afterwards, that was the achievement. And we don't need to all kind of go on this ecstatic journey together. Is that, am I getting that right?
Well, yes. I mean, it came from, because I was so interested in like my own pathway through choreography, went really through examining linear choreography, non-linear choreography, and sort of in the late 90s, I got really interested in complexity studies, chaos theory. Like it was very hip at that time, sort of emerging as new ways of organizing, looking at organization, underlying organization. So I went through that kind of developing choreographic methodologies to, you know, of swarming, of all these kind of modeling early on. And then later on, when I sort of got rid of them, you know, when I thought the mapping itself is a problematic, like this scientific mapping of order of something that is actually in us, and we are both the map and the territory as a body. I found it more interesting but I realized, especially when I did Parliament, and I did Parliament originally when I went to Athens, and the Minaki Museum commissioned a work to deal with the Greek trouble. Like I was probably the only artist I knew that moved to Athens. Nobody moved to Athens. I'm married to a Greek woman, so that's just the reason I moved to Athens. And so it was like And I realized that in organizations, on a pure organizational front, every picture I found of performance was everybody looking in the same direction, or everybody facing in the same direction. There was always a directionality, a common directionality about things. Everything organizes in circles that sort of assumes an equal distance from a shared middle. Like there was always this kind of there was nothing except some picnic where people would be like really facing in any directions, and it would still hold together as a social organization. So I was interested in how do you achieve that? How do you achieve that there's an autonomy in each agent? Well, at that time it was called agent when you do programming of the, but in the sense of how do you create an autonomy of each participant? And yet, so you expand individual freedom and you yet create a social glue. So, and this kind of, this magic proportionality between individual freedom and social glue, or even not presented as a binary, but end-to-end, like that both is possible at the same time. For me, that is a very exciting prospect. And I think that is carrying through, that it's like almost like the holy grail. Like, how do you create this situations that yes, they are social, but they're also accepting, they're radically accepting. And when I say radically accepting, I mean also people who would be outside of my own ideological perspective, and would include people who just would never, be in touch with the avant-garde as such. Like a lot of people who take part in our events or in our kind of projects are really people who would not be considered avant-garde, interested in the avant-garde either. So, and yet it's very avant-garde. Like it is connected to the 60s. It is picking up to say, absolutely. Like, I mean, there's a lot of passion from our side for these sort of forgotten attempts. Actually, Michael Hart, I didn't bring it, just wrote a book about the 70s, and about these forgotten attempts. When we think of that actually the politics or experimental politics stopped in the 70s, when actually it was really happening in the 70s, it just failed in a weird way. It just didn't really come to fruition. It didn't come, but that doesn't mean you abandon the project of trying to find other ways of living together and creating a more equitable reality, both between humans and non-human world. So I think that, but now, and as to your kind of observation, it is weird that you can get all these people and they're not cynical. I think it's very exciting. Like I think that's for me the most exciting part of being at a research university, of working with all these professors. I mean, if you Google 11th Organ 1 program, you'll see like the 23 names from all different disciplines, and that they partake and get excited about it, that there is an excitement, and that and it's, for me, it's a clear sign that everybody knows the deal is rotten. Like it seems like everybody knows. I mean, I talk to the bosses, to leadership. Everybody knows. They just don't know how to move, how to maneuver, because everyone keeps each other in place in the strangest way. So everybody feels incredibly disempowered to do anything. That's how I feel at university level often.
That's really interesting. I would like to push on. I want to definitely come to Dominique's question, but let me make another iteration of my question as well. And thinking about, again, I have several things to say, so I'm just going to put them out there and hopefully it'll come to a point. I mean, because I am really interested in these name choices, Parliament Amendment, Constitution Inauguration, that are so explicitly engaging with that kind of what's understood to be a political process. I was thinking about, when we talk about Parliament, like I was thinking about the encampments now, the protest encampments at various universities, and these kinds of, or like Occupy encampments, how they were, the way of coming together. But again, those are organized around, in this case, very specific political intentions. Whereas what you're talking about, as you're just saying, is much more, I don't know what to call it, is, is it more diverse or is it just differently positioned? I guess that's kind of what I'm asking. So let me introduce two kind of questions. First thing is I want to mention this, I mean, I do want to talk about the kind of the institutional situation, the whiteness of the institutional situation, everything. I'm looking at this book, which we just had Arabella Stanger. I don't know if you know this book,
Mm.
Dancing on Violent Ground, but it's about also about Cunningham, and it's about the Cunningham and Black Mountain College and the kind of
Mhm.
what it is to have these utopian experiments in these institutional contexts. I'm also thinking of Duke. I mean, Duke University Press, obviously independent from
Mhm.
Duke, but
Mhm.
of course, it's like the producer of this incredible Black Studies list that has been totally transformative to me over the past 5 or 6 years in terms of thinking about how to imagine thinking about another world being possible or to think otherwise that cannot be done without a critique of whiteness. So I'm in a certain way, I'm just reiterating the question about difference,
Mhm.
and different kinds of difference. But what I really want to drill into, which is where I'll make my more pointed question, is like, okay, we're in this institutional situation, we're structured by whiteness, we're structured by patriarchy. I'm also thinking about that, gender in relation to touch. I've just been
Mhm.
just been seeing some of these conversations around contact improvisation online and the kind of different ways that that's developing, which is very much coming out of that same moment. It's one of the only lineages, I suppose, of that moment that has this ongoing existence, absolutely continuous since then, but is very much confronting these questions of touch, the ethics of touch, how to make the boundaries, how to negotiate the boundaries. So, what I really want to understand is, how do you structure these events? Like, can we get more into the shop talk and the structuring details of it? Because what you said was like, and what I see when I look at it from the outside is like, okay, people are invited to come to a place. It has a title, Parliament.
Mhm.
Uh, I think it's indicated to them that they are meant to not speak. You said there's a sort of a brief introduction or something, but I'm
Yeah.
like, are there, and I was very interested when you said that you're not usually in the room, because I'm constantly
Mhm.
looking for how to be in the room while
Mhm.
divesting myself of that potential
Mhm.
of a unproductive authority. Um, but like, okay, if you're not in the room, like, what is the presence of the score? How is the score delivered? In what form? How does power circulate? I guess not in terms of because everybody brings their own knowledge, everybody brings
Mhm.
their own habitus or embodied scores, everybody brings their own whatever, but like in terms of how the event is structured, what you do or what the lab does, are
Mhm.
there are there roles, are there people who are sort of plants who are there with some kind
Mhm.
of other relation to the score? Is the score written? I mean, I'm just like,
No.
is it really just like an introductory paragraph and then there's nothing else except for the room? How is it, what's the mechanism, what's the
It,
laboratory
well, uh,
technology?
but it's different for each of the different situations that we do it, because we always try to kind of do things, then analyze how it could be done differently or better, or sort of like if you see a problem, like in Parliament. uh, I mean, aid went for a little while. I don't know if it still goes, but it went viral for a little while. Like loads of people did parliaments across Europe, which was a surprise to me, which I didn't know. Like people were just doing their own little thing. So I don't know to what extent that was like the experience, but uh, that's okay because it's open source. Like I have no problem people doing that at all. Uh, in the case of Parliament, I would usually introduce it. So it takes 15 minutes to introduce it. Where it's coming from, the work, what are the ways to think about it, the ordering forces, how to observe, how to act, it's a very few pointers, which are called propositions rather than rules. Uh, and a core thing is, do not be creative, do not have ideas within the space. There's a few more things, but there's this kind of, don't be creative. Like, don't go and say like you need to do something here. Actually, creativity will be in the way of being in this room, uh, because it sort of will override, and the creativity is also sort of very biased already. Like there's so much bias in creativity, and so much social performance of a certain kind of identity, or a certain kind of creativity, a certain kind of being in the room. So trying to kind of quiet that aspect. And then there's really, so there's 15 minutes and it's done by myself, or a collaborator can do it as well. Like I have a really great team of artists I'm working with. And then literally that's it. There's no sound, there's nothing in the room. People's told they can still go to the bathroom if they need to, but once they come back, doors closed. And there's different parliaments. There's an open parliament, there's a closed parliament like this, which has like 80 people in a room, 100 people in a room, and it's closed for shortest is like 3 hours, longest is 10 hours, whatever time it is. And then people go out at the end, and then you have usually a shared meal outside, like this, usually an Indian meal waiting here in Duke, Indian food. It just happened like that. It could be any, but that's how it happened. There ever children? There are children, but usually there are no children. And this is purely, it's simpler with touch. Now, my daughter, who's 9 years old, she's in everything. She just doesn't, it's okay. And I'm totally okay with that. So there are sometimes children in it. And then there's an open parliament, which is in a museum, like it will be next year in Greece, where there's a stock of citizens. So you have a base of citizens who have the briefing, but then you also have the audience that comes through that doesn't have the briefing, but that have guides that tell them sort of how to think about it. And so some people just integrate without the full knowledge of the situation, but nobody knows who's who because everybody's just themselves in the way they present. So you never know, and people might be having done parliaments years ago, or you just never know. And it's just becoming like this flow of people that are in it. So that has a very different flair, but it also a very similar flair. It's hard to describe. It's not that dissimilar, even though you think it would be. So that's Parliament. But then in the other work, like Amendment, which was just done in Athens 2 months ago, there would be 9 different people who do the briefing. And with 9 different kind of styles, but yet really rehearsed, because it makes a big difference. Like if I do a briefing of a parliament and I get a little bit too funny, the whole parliament becomes funny. So it's an incredible way how mimetic humans are in the way they understand instructions. It really is incredible. Like, so I'm usually preparing for hours to do this 15 minutes to make it look effortless when I present it, and sort of having the right, sort of the whatever right means, but having a certain kind of poise that takes almost away as a specific directionality, but also infuses a certain kind of seriousness in the endeavor, rather than a frivolous experience. And then each of these are very different, and sometimes, like, especially, and that's also important to mention, like the last 3 works that we did was really developed as a class of 15 to 20 people here at Duke, and the class is undergrads, grads, postdocs, but the postdocs are in biophysics or something like that. Like they're in cellular behavior. So it has a very different, and some older professors as well. You might know the name Roger Copeland from What is Dance? He's, for example, in the class, is an emeritus professor now who just happened to live in the area. So he was part of the last project. So we have from 18 to 80, anybody a lot of people in this process. And we kind of try out different situations, then discuss and kind of adjust and find new propositions. And at some point it settles quite well. So that is the experience. So this research team is actually super important. None of these projects is developed by me sitting in the studio, sitting in a cafe and thinking it through. It's really developed between people doing it and then bringing new material to it and forming it slowly like that. Yeah.
That's very interesting and makes a lot of sense, and it kind of that's what I want to get to, because it reveals some of the what I was finding very mysterious, because it can be so mysterious when you present, like, it's an open space, and yet all of these things magically happen, and yet actually there, these are the layers, is that there are these layers of sort of a sustained kind of ensemble situation or lab where things are being worked out practically, and then, as you say, it's hours of preparation to deliver this 15-minute framing thing. I wanted to ask you just briefly, and I want to come back to things in the chat, but like, you said it's open source, and I wanted to know, like, you mentioned different versions of Parliament and they're all sort of scores, and there's this briefing. Now, are there textual versions of those that people can access that are published, or when you say it's open source, you mean it transmits through people who experience it and then go and do it?
No, it's not written, because the score is not. If you think of it as a score, I think it looks like a score, but it cannot be understood as a score. I find it's more than just a paper. It's really in the delivery of, by having had. So how it works at the moment is you have to have had the experience. You have to do it in Parliament to then go and do it yourself. Like, that's really all the demand. And it's the same on panels. Like, I had a panel with 8 professors, and the demand was, you cannot talk about it. You have to be in it to talk about it. So that was also, so that's how you sort of get. That was initially when it was still very difficult for me to get people entrusting into this process, from evolutionary anthropology and primate behavior or expert, to engage in this. But for them to really meaningfully talk about it, unless they have the experience, I don't feel they can meaningfully talk about it, or an economist, or whoever was talking about it. So, yeah.
I mean, like, so that's super interesting, because and it's very post-Grotowskian, and it's very 70s to say that the way it's transmitted is through that you have to be there. But then it raises those same questions of, like, what's the relationship to writing, or, as I've been asking it recently in the last 10 years, to video, but to things that become discursive, so that it's not, because of course there's a profound kind of democratic element to that you're there, and there's an that's the utopian impulse, like, you have to be there, it's transmitted through the body, it's not a score because it's not logocentric, right? But then at the same time, it can also be exclusive, it can be elite in some way, even regardless of who's involved, just because it's not, it's a thing that you have to go and access physically. It's not allowing itself to be shared in some ways through the channels that we have, whether textual or digital.
I sort of agree. I mean, especially in case of Parliament, but I've met like 2 young Ukrainian women a couple of years ago. They at the Vienna Dance Festival, they sought me out and said, "Oh, we've done parliaments all across the Ukraine in the last couple of years." I had no idea that they were doing it. I had never met them before. I didn't know they were learning it in a 24-hour parliament in Italy. So I knew nothing about either. And so it has a different way of moving by making it open source and making it a kind of practice as well. Now, but that's very Parliament specific, I think. There's a book actually written about it, published by CUNY University, by the Siegel Center, called Permanent Parliament, by the great Corey Tamla. And I think that book is actually quite successful in talking about Parliament in many ways. And you sort of get how it works, I think. It tries to be, I guess, a Parliament in writing as well, to some extent. So there are ways, and Parliament is this very specific animal. I think, for example, the Utopians, this other work that I did for the Athens Festival, you can watch that online. There's a link on my website on the notice board. It's sort of hidden, it shouldn't be online. That really translates well, and it's a one-shot, extremely high quality capture of this event It's an amazing screenable documentary. And I also have like a full documentary made about this process as well that is already just being finished these days. So there are ways in which this is, in some projects like Amendment, which is this other project that we just did in Athens, we even didn't announce it. Like the whole point was, let's do it more like we used to do techno clubs, illegal techno clubs in the 90s, when there was no announcement, just word of mouth. And we had 250 people, just word of mouth. It was nowhere announced. And it was from Greek Orthodox priest to the psychiatrists department from the public hospital, 4 or 5 doctors. Like it was like an incredible diverse group in the room of 200 people. We had to turn 50 away. And that, for example, is never recorded. We don't allow photographs. We ask all photographs to be deleted. I've never seen the work in taking place either. So this is a kind of different animal. It's almost like and then there are other things that are very public, like the utopians, which can be filmed, which publicly accessible. Like there were at the big festival, the screening, they will be screened. CUNY just screened it in one of their performance film festivals. So there is a kind of, there's different ways, I think. It's not just one way. I'm not very dogmatic around it. Just Parliament doesn't, I want to prevent it from just being read as a linear score, because I think that would defeat it.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat about the participants reflecting about the experience, and I think so. One thing you've mentioned is that there's a meal afterwards, which is really, really interesting and important, which I didn't realize. And then the other thing you also mentioned, kind of the iterative process amongst the lab group of analysis. Yeah. What else? How does it get reflected on, and what about participants reflecting on it?
Well, in the lab group, we use social dreaming a lot, which is a practice of Gordon Lawrence, the psychoanalytic practice developed in the 70s and 80s at the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations in London. So it's a social scientist who has passed since, but originally that has a huge following, social dreaming, and we've been very close to this process. I've been, like Gordon Lawrence came to DACTA, for example, to do with us social dreaming, and that's a way to really use nighttime dreams and over weeks, kind of stringing them together and having kind of information given to the group through the dreams. It's an incredibly effective way of connecting, because you start dreaming other people's dreams further in the group, if you do a practice. It's just you have to also experience it. Social dreaming is very strong. Then, strangely, the research group doesn't process much verbally, that much as I thought they would. There's always saying like, let's not talk about it. And then once a while we have really great discussions about, because there's so many different viewpoints from so many different people, that there are really interesting discussions emerging out of it. As to the participants to come to the works, sometimes we have like follow-up brunch or something like that to process it. Sometimes we don't, and this is still something to look into, how to work that. Like if we want to, I feel like often in Parliament people come out and they're almost ecstatic with the experience they had about a different way of being in the world, and then they just, and we don't want to just debrief and kind of file it away neatly. But then a lot of people here get really affected by it, that they cannot live their life like that outside, and that there is no support group for this realization, or no supporting mechanism in this realization. And so we're working on that. We're actually thinking, okay, what are we going to do about that? And how could we use this process to then actually go and really work the social, in the social more. And that's the sort of next process that we hope to address a little bit in the exhibition. Again, their resources is a real issue. To how do you do that without really resourcing people and employing people.
Oh, yeah.
So that's a core thing, like how the resourcing, and that's why I'm thinking also about a whole institution, like how would it look like to have a cultural institution that would be resourced to really experiment in these realms. Yeah.
That's my dream also. Kate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'd love to kind of reframe my question because we've moved on a little bit from it in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
I guess when you talk about the flow in Parliament between kind of audience coming in and not knowing who's who, I'm wondering if it's like being a SPAC actor in Theatre of the Oppressed work where you can, I mean, I guess, in that one you're conscious of I'm stepping out and witnessing or I'm jumping back in. But I'm curious about how like the not knowing manifests in a way. And then I guess my second question is about transmission of the work out, right? Because we've kind of acknowledged this lineage of, I mean, for Ben, the post-Grotowski, for myself, the contemplative performance, avant-garde American lineage. But I can sort of understand the not wanting to like succumb to the seductive trap of text, right? Of the logocentricity of the score, because that can often be a betrayal of sophistication of a process. So I'm wondering, is maybe the transmission not only who is in the room, but how this work might gain traction in the field, or like Sophie was alluding to earlier, kind of the political edge to it that can come about. So I guess I'm curious about transmission. If it's not text, then is it the field? Is it who's in the room? Is it the archived footage? Is it the discussion at brunch and then someone learning it down the line? I'm just curious about maintaining the integrity of the work and how you do that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm equally curious. I'm not saying, like for me, a lot of it, I've lost interest in the arts world, I think. Profoundly lost interest in the arts world in the last few years, which came as a surprise. And maybe it's just getting older, that you just have different aims and objectives. Because I was very much engaged in sort of high-level arts production. I'm still engaged to some degree, but I'm no longer chasing it. So I'm no longer, because a lot of, I feel, archiving or a lot of this kind of process is done with a view to creating a career or creating social capital in a way for oneself. And I'm really curious in the ideas, like how can they go to work? How can they go to work at Duke, which is always like where I am in a way. And there's also a limitation to it. I don't feel like I am in Durham, where Duke is based. Like I don't really engage in the community, because Duke itself is like a city, and it's so overwhelming in itself as a, if you move into a place. But for me, it's always fascinating that the ideas don't go to work. Like you've got all these great thinkers here. I mean, it's like an incredible catalog of thought and ideas, and yet the ideas cannot go to work. And I'm, it looks like a very comfortable capitalist utopia. And yet the entire Marxist thought that is present, so it doesn't embody itself. Whether you're pro or con or indifferent, it doesn't embody. You cannot feel it, you cannot see it, you cannot smell it. It's only in books. It's only in the minds of people, and then shifted over without touching the world, between heads, as long as it doesn't touch anything. So it's like a telepathic miracle of how all these ideas maintain themselves without ever touching ground, I feel.
Would you call that disembodied? Would you call that
I don't know if it's disembodied. It has no potency.
Sure.
And it's almost, it's the game as well, though. A lot of people don't really want the potency, to the responsibility to say this needs to be different. This needs to be we need to grow some flowers here. I don't know. We need to grow some wild garlic. That's what one of my students really wanted to do. And he found no way of growing wild garlic on campus. So it's this kind of a reality, I think, that people are kind accustomed to. So that is really one of my core interests, is how do you, and it feels like running against the wall at times. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm particularly successful, but I feel like we are the strangest lab that is in existence in a top tier American university, in the sense of social acceptability. So that in itself is a miracle, I find, and that sort of sustains and is sort of often enough, I find. It brings so many people in conversation with each other that you feel like, yeah, it starts radiating. And when we had 4 years ago, when you needed to drag 4 people in, or 6 people or 8 people into the room and convince them, we now have no problem getting 200 people. So there's an attitude that is changing. There's the university itself is sort of starting to embrace it, or has embraced it for the last couple of years for sure, in its communication. So as to, would I like more to be published, more to be written, more discourse to happen? Yes, of course. Am I the one to do this? No. I know that of myself. I just don't like writing that much. It's not my what do you call it? It's not my practice. Doesn't come easy to me. Like, I really have to work it to write. And so, yeah, it's one thing that, some things are overdeveloped, some things are underdeveloped, and as to how to propagate it into the world, I think at the moment we just use wild random arrows in all directions and working where we're working. And of course, I mean, also there's some sort of trust, because I was successful or semi-successful as a choreographer in a traditional field. And like I didn't get probably enough credit to William Forsythe here as my mentor, or as well, like that I worked with very closely and worked for Ballet Frankfurt, which was an incredible thought place of its time, like an incredible, Foresight enabled for people to meet from all different kinds of places and to do things together. So it was almost this enabling that made Ballet Frankfurt so great, or a great time for a short while. Yeah, so that is also something I should give credit to.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. I have a question that maybe can conclude, unless anyone wants to jump in with a burning question or comment. I want to ask you, picking up on what you were just saying about the potency and the capacity to put this all to work, and also this this other institution that we mentioned. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, because underneath this idea of doing a Lines of Flight seminar series on new laboratories is this sense that Kate and I and Colin and others have been discussing about these laboratories, the use of the laboratory concept, but really to create these, as you said, these kind of weird spaces that are on the edge or troubling, or academia or para-academic. And there are so many of them. We started to make a list and we have 60 or so. And they're very differently placed though, like, yes, like it's amazing. You're at Duke, you're at the Keenan Center, so you have these resources and it's possible to scale in that way. That's great. We at Center for Experimental Practices, I think we were on that path for about a year and a half, 2 years now. There was a lot of funding, a lot of possibility. I think it could have grown in that way, but it looks like it's now going to be killed this summer. Or temporarily paralyzed until it can move somewhere else. And then I think of, for example, Aaron Manning and Sense Lab and 3 Ecologies with this kind of idea of buying some land, going off the grid in that way. But then how is that run? How is that organized? how do we, this is my question, really practical, and don't feel you need to answer this, but I'm going to ask you anyway. How do we connect these labs? How do we make an alternative institution that knits together these labs in this exactly the way you're describing, right? Where each lab has its autonomy, each lab has its difference. We're not going to homogenize. We're not going to make like a single institution that eats them all up. But they're so separate now, and it's like, this conversation has to be just the beginning of a kind of a large network or cohort or alternative sociality of these alternative spaces that have this contested relation to both academia and the arts.
Well, it sounds like what is it? What is that called? A peak funding application in Austria, artistic research, which I've done in the past, and it's a pain. So I think that would be a great idea to actually create a network that does that, that brings the different laboratories together, and I mean, similar to the laboratory because you just mentioned Erin and Brian, they both came to Rise to the summer school that we used to run on Hydra, and that was done without any public funding. Like, I have not received arts funding for the last 15 years, I think. No, not 15, 12 years. So public arts funding, I've not accessed. I also didn't pursue it anymore because I had a lot, and I got very disillusioned by the courtedness of that. You become sort of working towards a court of some sort by having these kind of monies within the arts realities of whatever country you're producing. And I presented, I think, 4 different countries in official capacity as Irish, as English, as Austrian, and as Greek. Actually, it's quite funny. So that made me grow kind of a little bit cynical around these things. But there is, and I wonder if there's, I'm always liking the notion of taking it out of the arts, like literally saying like, what funding is there in the social sciences for this kind of work, or thinking in a complete different ways that we haven't pursued yet. Is the United Nations funding? I don't know. Like, I'm just making it up. In a way that would free up a certain dialogue. So it's also not the same people in the room with the same issues and the same, but actually you talk to people that, like, I would love to, if the Institute or the Laboratory for Social Choreography now would work on national defense, like literally thinking through national defense with generals. That would be interesting. I would have no idea. It would scare me. I would have no idea what to say, but that's a good starting point. I find like these things of where to infuse creativity in, where to actually start, where's your starting point? Who is your audience, or so on. And I'm just saying, this would scare me. And so it's probably worth it to pursue completely different kind of fields. And I've been offered doing a workshop with the CEO of Coca-Cola and the 3-star general, and I actually chickened out. I was like, I haven't, because it was only an hour, and you can't do anything in an hour. So the question is, what can you do that has potency, but it's not within the arts, but actually using all this kind of experience and knowledge and soft knowledge and specific knowledge and so on, knowledge bases to actually affect society.
Yeah. Kate, you want to jump in before we wrap up?
I do. I just have a final question about that. Ben and I were chatting earlier, and what keeps coming up for me and listening to you is Arawana Hayashi's social presencing theater, because that is frequently used in the context of hospitals who want to reorganize, corporations who need to learn empathy and how to 4D map out change, right? And when you talk about working with 3-star generals, the Defense Department does in fact hire performers. I have declined that job. I do wonder, right? Like, how then does the work not become, and no offense to those two, like, I guess didactic applied theater,
Yeah,
right?
no,
That
no,
loses. Do you know what I mean though?
no,
Like,
no.
how does it get to stay in
Well,
this beautiful form where we're able to, that's what I mean by the how does it transmit out to the field, right? Like, we're not going to teach a 3-star general empathy. I mean, if we do, great. But
no,
like,
but
it's, you know what I mean?
but yes, I mean, I think that because I had a company running when New Labour came to power and all the funding strategies changed into really kind of social remedying social problems through the arts, and there became sort of a drive towards that, which was well-meaning, but I think it was unhealthy in the way how it was done. And I'm a complete in opposition of that. Like, it's not like I'm a consultant that would go into that's not of interest. I'm interested in, and this goes maybe more into mystery. Like, I did a project where I spent 2 weeks embedded in the Irish government, like that was years ago. I don't know, we went to 2012. And I was there with no role and no purpose, with high security clearance in the Irish government. And that was set up by the Irish Museum of Modern Art together with the Minister of Education. And it was an incredible 2 weeks being in the Irish government as somebody who was a kind of like, where everything is such a tight wheel of mechanics in government, to have to just be there and sort of almost as a poetic body, of a poetic space of no purpose. And to be able to roam. And I feel like this role could have been, I loved going to work there, with no, having no work, like literally just going to all these meetings. And, but I feel like there's something in that it doesn't have to lose its, I feel this need for social choreographers or to be part of the conversation, to be in different tables, not just to develop some otherness, which is, yes, you can go off and into the woods and develop alternative systems, and I'm all for it, and I have rows of friends doing that, and admire that. But to actually be part of that conversation, I find that exciting as a potential. Like, how do you do that without losing the mystery, without losing all this that you bring to the table, not packaging it as a kind of service too. That would be disastrous. Like, no interest. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that response. No, it's nice to hear that that's the goal of it, because that's what I would hope for, right? And I equally think that those conversations are necessary. Those interventions are necessary. So I think it's wonderful that you're hoping for that and doing that.
Yeah. I mean, it's ideologically driven. I mean, it's not like I don't have hard evidence that it's going to be that way or that it makes sense, but everything tells me this could be a very productive way of participating in the larger democratic project, by having people present who have poetry and a possibility, who see the third possibility, the unthought thought, who see the expanded imaginations, and it can create situations between people so they can also access it. So how do you get people from different spectrums together in a room and really experience certain things and be able to tap into other kind of realities? I think that's the development potential. It's not like saying we have all the answers at all. But I feel like we have more answers than most people. Like, if I listen to the new curriculum in whatever, there's a new curriculum being brought out by Duke every 25 years. I feel like we have more answers, like a lot more answers. And I'm aware of the limitations because I'm part of different committees, of course. But as an artist, you also used to, I don't know, enforcing experiences, like almost against people's wills a little bit. Like, you used to going against the norms. You used to speaking your mind. You used to be less scared of the things, less scared of exploration of play. So I think you have a lot to offer in these situations. But you have to choose the battles also quite wisely. Like, I chose not to be on that committee, for example. So, yeah.
Well, that's very hopeful and helpful, and thank you.
Well, thank you for
Thanks
for
for being
listening.
here. Yeah.
2 hours. Good. We did
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Once again, I thought it was going to end sooner, and there was just too much to say.
No, it's good. I mean, I'm like, if you don't stop me, we're still here in 2 hours. So it's good.
Right.
All right. Well, looking forward to future conversations.
Yeah. Likewise.
And good luck.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Bye.